Yeah, my name is Mark. I'm with Lakestar. We recently opened an office here in Berlin. We're delighted to be here for the imminent task to close the gap between seed and late-stage finance. If you do a quick comparison of the two continents that we all know relatively well, the US and Europe, obviously we witness and we observe a very stark difference in funding levels and valuations. If you just look at the average round size, ticket size is really, you can basically multiply what is being done in Europe by 2 or 3, and then you have the funding volume that currently is imminent in the US. Part of the reason why that's the case, from our perspective, is simply they've been doing it for quite some time over there in the US, and European-based venture capital firms have been smaller in size and have been less able to attract capital from resources such as family offices, institutional funds, and even the government sector. It's improving slightly, and I'll get to that, but in principle, that's a big challenge for the ecosystem over here. Why is that the case? I mean, they've been starting in the 50s and 60s with the semiconductor industry, as you all know, and that has led to some and numerous funds competing for a few select deals every year that have the unicorn potential, and that drives valuations dramatically. And some even are of the opinion that valuations are a little bit inflated by now across the Atlantic, something that a privilege that we don't have in Europe across the board yet. So if you compare what happens in the late-stage financing environment in Europe, you still see the dominance of US VCs and US venture capital money flowing into European startups. It's across the board. I mean, if you look at UK, Germany, and France, with different levels of volume, you basically observe that US money is still flowing into the companies out here, and that's a very dominant feature of the current state of the ecosystem. Now, I'd like to quickly address the topic that we have at hand, and that's the basic question that was asked. You know, Europe versus US, and it's a little bit of a contrarian view of you know, or contradicting view of which VC is better. And we are of the strong belief that the combination of the two ecosystems and the sources of funding can actually mean a very or produce a very meaningful outcome for you as a startup founder. And I'd like to briefly get into why. If you have the right investor on board, and that's why I say choose carefully, that can open the door to further financing in the US. You both have the privilege of working with a US-minded European VC, and you have the door open to attract further financing in the United States. But that, of course, depends heavily on the network and the connections your investor has in the United States. The other phenomenon we observe when we are being asked about financing here in Europe from US VCs is simply they look for a little bit of guidance and market knowledge. So they look for a local presence of an investor here in Europe to understand and guide their thinking on certain developments. And we can help them as Lakestar to understand that ecosystem a little bit better, and on the flip side, help European firms go to the US markets, both for fundraising and for operational needs. I'll close with the remark that we're delighted now to be in Berlin and be on such a great panel with both 500 startups and Thrive, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
All right. You can sit down. Thanks. Yeah. Hey. And next up is Miles of Thrive Capital, and you got the remote right here.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me out here. I thought I'd give everyone a bit of background on Thrive. As the US venture firm here, not too many of you might know of us. If you go to our website, we also don't have too much information available. We are a 7-person team based out of New York and manage about $750 million now. We've been doing it for 4 years. And we've invested around the world and across a variety of different sectors and industries. In the US, we've done a lot of e-commerce, both on the platform level and in brands, things like Warby Parker and Harry's. That's sort of how we got our start in the early days. It also did a lot of consumer stuff, things like Instagram and Twitch. And have been increasingly doing enterprise, SaaS, both vertical enterprise, things like Hightower for the real estate industry or Benchling for life science research, as well as more horizontal plays, things like JustWorks, which is a HR software. And we've increasingly, from the beginning, tried to look globally, not just in New York, where we're based, in SF, but increasingly in Europe, and actually done some in Brazil. Here in Europe, we've supported 4 teams, mostly at Series A or B, not at the seed round. And then also down in Brazil, one big investment in Pitsy, which is a cell phone insurance company. And so we really believe and want to continue investing around the world across different stages, from late to early, and in different sectors. A little bit about myself, in case it's helpful. You can find me around here after. Personally, I enjoy spending a lot of time trying to find opaque public data on private companies to kind of shed light on traction of different industries, or the dynamics of different marketplaces, etc. So have a bunch of projects like that up online, and spend a lot of time with our e-commerce, SaaS, and sort of infrastructure investments. The sort of question of the panel was, US versus Europe. I very much also agree that it should be an and we've always worked with other partners here in Europe locally, and supported them in later rounds as teams have come to the US to try and expand their product into the US market. I think the kind of questions, the typical considerations everyone asks, obviously, is, do I have a personal fit with the investor that I'll be taking, right? They're going to come on your board and be very involved, and having that personal match is very important. Do they understand my industry? That can happen whether you're in the US or Europe. Obviously, industries kind of transcend those borders. Is it a good capital match? Are they in it for the long term? Are they going to be supportive, if necessary, for follow-on inside rounds? But the only sort of interesting, unique consideration is, do they really understand my target market? And so when we've done a lot of things, it's been teams coming into the US, whether it's enterprise software or a social network trying to expand into the US market, or an e-commerce company. We have yet to do, but would like to do, more things where it's really a Europe market-specific company, whether that's remittances and handling kind of cross-border currency flows here, which is sort of a unique problem as well. Things like BlaBlaCar have done very well here and aren't looking to the US, but more actually heading east. Just because I believe that no slides should have come without data, I sort of went and looked at Crunchbase and just tried to look at what the different dynamics of markets were. Obviously, the US, I don't know how much Crunchbase is used here, sort of the shared public database of companies and investors, but certainly use it a lot in the US. Clear difference in sort of the scope of the market. The interesting thing that you can't tell on this is actually the ratio of investors to companies. It's actually slightly higher here in Europe in Crunchbase, which I thought was intriguing. That's it. Thank you, guys.
Yep.
How close should we sit on this panel?
Hey. At least one fan here. All right, what am I doing? Should I use the laser on this? How does this work? Ah, there we go. I can hear myself. Ah, wonderful. Let me go back. All right, my name is Sean Percival. I'm from 500 Startups. If you're not familiar with 500 Startups, they're the most active seed investor in Silicon Valley. We've done about 1,000 investments now, so we sort of joke that we may need to change the name. Primarily focused in the Valley in terms of where our staff is and where operations are. However, we do invest globally. So we've gone very deep into countries like Brazil, India, Southeast Asia, China, and Europe and Middle East is next. So that's one reason that we're here. In terms of my background, I'm a partner there. Previously, for the last year, I've worked at the Mountain View Accelerator, and so I've run that program. That program takes about 60 companies a year through a quick acceleration program. The focus on that is growth and fundraising. And that's really what our startups want. They want to grow fast. Once again, it is an accelerator, so the point of doing that is to be accelerated. Now, after that, I've sort of transitioned out of that and working next on the Nordics. And so Norway, Sweden, Finland, what we do is we like to go to these regions, we like to set up small micro funds, which helps us invest directly there, also helps us to build corporate strategic partnerships and other things that we can do to either help companies locally in that region or bring them to the Valley, get them a little taste of what's out there. I'm on Twitter, @Percival. If I say something that offends you or you want to heckle me, please tweet me or just follow me. Previously to that, so I was a founder. I like to say that I've lived the dream and the nightmare of doing a startup. Many of our operational staff do have that experience. The wounds are fresh. They've been there. They know what it takes to build a company. They've either been successful and sometimes not so much. I was vice president of a company called MySpace. I'm sure you're all familiar with that site and use it to this day. And I did online marketing for them. That's most of my experience. And rolling way back, I was actually a janitor. That's how I got into startups. I was a janitor. Life wasn't really going anywhere. I was cleaning office buildings of the startups in 1999. As I was doing this, it looked interesting. It was midnight. I was working the graveyard shift, which is midnight to 8 a.m. I'm cleaning the office. They're all smoking in the office, drinking Mountain Dew, playing video games. To me, I thought that might be a little more fun than actually being a janitor, and perhaps a little more lucrative as well, too. So what I wanted to do is basically talk about sort of the quick pros and cons of US versus EU investors. So on the US, of course, there's more capital available, especially at the early stage. So you have a concentration of capital, engineering talent. Silicon Valley is very unique in that regard. Access to Silicon Valley is important, and that's where we sort of strengthen, where we feel that we can help companies the most. So let's say, for example, you're a video company and you want to do a deal with YouTube, or you just want to talk to them. It's easy for us to facilitate those connections, or they actually come to our office as mentors and help you from there. So also good, valuations are higher. So maybe this is better for the founder than it is for the investors. But obviously you've probably heard, it's a very frothy market right now. In some cases it's a little absurd. We're kind of going with it. I wouldn't say it's a bubble, although there's a lot of talk about if it is or not. It's definitely a boom. But obviously this is much different than the economy in the 90s, where most companies were going to public markets. They didn't really have much to speak of. Now we have companies like Uber and Slack. Their valuations are insane and very high, but they're generating revenue. Uber is doubling revenue every 6 months, and they're already at scale. So in some cases, those valuations are warranted. In terms of cons, so negatives, there is international squeamishness. I would say 500 is one of the few funds. We are not afraid to get out of our backyard and go find great companies across the world. We sort of have a mandate. We feel that there's 1 million great founders out there across the world, and so we want to try and help and fund them all. But many other investors don't in the Silicon Valley. And I'll tell you, the big reason for that is, one, I think it's two things. Once again, if they want to facilitate connections, it's very easy for them to make an intro. You drive across the street to Facebook, and you start meeting. And then other concerns are obviously around liquidity, local regulations. So I think I'm seeing this turn a little bit, but there's definitely been a lot of squeamishness about investing into international companies. It's more competitive. And it is insanely competitive. And when we work with international companies, a lot of times they come to the accelerator and their first question is should I bring my whole team over? And I'm always like, no, your engineers will be stolen. You are not going to compete with Google and Facebook and other folks in terms of competition and opportunity. So competition is very extreme right now there. And then also negative is the higher valuations. So this is a positive and a negative. And the big negative on this is, let's say you are raising at a high valuation in your seed round. If you're not maintaining and hitting certain milestones, it may be very difficult to hit that A round and increase that valuation. And of course, the dreaded and the worst thing that could happen is you do a flat round or you do a down round. So there is some craziness around this. I mean, to me, when I see an early stage company that has very little revenue, very little traction, and they're commanding a $10 million valuation, that is concerning. I'm less concerned about some of the later stage valuations, but those early stage are a little bit concerning. Let's talk EU. So EU investors. So number one, most importantly, they dress a lot better than US investors. They wear the suits. I had to dust this off and put the hoodie away to come out here. So they obviously dress a lot better. International focus, obviously. They're not willing, or they're willing to get on planes. They're willing to sort of have different satellite offices. And so even if they're based in London, where a lot of them are, they're willing to go to other countries, whether it be here or the Nordics or anywhere else. And I feel too that the view is a little bit longer term. And I think that we're a bit spastic in the US, especially for us. We'd like to see a company make or break in a few months in the accelerator program. We'd love to see liquidity in 1 to 3 years. I think UE investors are a little bit more patient in that regard. So what are the negative? What are the cons? This may be controversial, but I've definitely heard of a lot of EU investors being very greedy on equity. And this is really, really concerning. If somebody wants 40% of your company at the early stage, you should run and never talk to them again. In the Valley, they're a lot more mindful of this. They want to make sure that cap table doesn't get full, because you're going to need to do several rounds. So be very, very careful. I think a good investor wouldn't do that, but be very, very careful of angel investors who are commanding that 20 and 30% at the early stage. You're giving away far too much of the company at that point. Valuations are lower. So this may be a bit of a negative. It's actually a positive for us, though. We feel we can get in, our money goes further, and there's opportunities for doing international arbitrage, where we can come in here, help an EU company, and then bring them over to the States and let them see the upside there. A little more risk averse. As well, too. I think that I see the opposite side of the spectrum, where we probably don't understand what risk aversity is. With 500, obviously, we're investing very broadly in very, very early stage, but we do see a little bit more in Europe. And then finally, I just kind of want to end on, regardless of where the investor is, these are attributes that you probably want to find in your investors. Number one, they are value add. I put that in quotes because it's getting a little bit cliche. Everyone talks about that. But what is value add? They're more than just the money. They can make connections, they can sit down with you, they can help drive the business, they can help with unit economics, they can make introductions to manufacturing. They actually do provide value. They're going to be for you there when things go wrong, and they will no doubt go wrong, especially at the early stage. And I tell you, I've raised money. The last company I raised money for, I can tell you half my investors, they were there. They would fall on the sword. They would sit with me late at night and help me do my financials. And the other half were off skiing or fucking off or doing something else. So be very, very careful about people that are going to be with you during the hard times, because they will come. And then what's also important, too, and we really emphasize this with our accelerator companies, your early investors need to send the right signals upstream to the next investor. So if they have money but they're not known, they're not with a great fund, they're not a well-known angel, they're not part of a corporation that people know, these are bad signals. You want someone to look at that cap table, look at you on angel list and say, oh yeah, I know him, I know her, and start to kind of go through that too. So it's really, really about signaling. They don't want to feel like they're the first real money coming into a investment. Other thing too, reputation to them is actually more important to than the capital they provide. Once again, maybe this is a Silicon Valley view where there is plentiful capital, but very, very important that to them, the reputation is more important. They are not going to screw you over. When you talk about them, they're going to talk about how helpful you are. So reputation is very, very important. It is one of the nice things about Silicon Valley. If you have a bad reputation, if you're a bad actor, you are pushed out very, very quick. You just don't get access. And then, of course, finally, they're fucking fun. Startups are very hard. The journey is very long. It is the path of most resistance. At the same time, when they all will buckle down and do the hard stuff with you, you also enjoy it. We enjoy it. Literally, one of our mottos, one of our values is to make money, have fun, and we certainly do that as well. I look forward to talking on the panel. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, John. So welcome, all three of you. Great to have you here. I think it's pretty unique to have West Coast, East Coast, and European perspective on one table. So I think that will make for an interesting discussion. The first thing that I want to touch upon is generally, if you look at the American and the European market, right, and you already pointed out some of the points here, what do you think are the biggest differences in terms of, besides maybe funding available, number of startups, you had some Crunchbase data in there, is there maybe also something about the founder mentality in particular that might be different in these two ecosystems? And maybe, Sean, you just talked about all the other pros and cons of the EU. Maybe you can start with that.
Yeah, that's what's been most exciting as we go to other regions. And when you go to a region like the Middle East, failure is such a bad thing there. Right. Whereas in Silicon Valley, we sort of joke about, oh, you failed? It's easy to fail up. So you can actually fail and actually progress. And so dealing with sort of cultural differences in it is interesting. Seeing ecosystems that are new, I would say Berlin's a lot more mature than a lot of ecosystems we look at. But the ecosystems that are interesting to us is sort of they've got over the hump. The new cohort that's coming out of schooling and is coming out of corporations, they're ready to fail, they're ready to work hard, they're ready to move fast. So I think that's the big advantage of the Valley. We're just hyperactive, moving so quick, and so other ecosystems not always moving so fast in that regard. Okay, interesting. Anything to add from your side?
Well, I think the general mentality in the U.S., we saw it with your presentation, Sean. You took your time and you obviously made your points very nicely. You guys are very much, you guys are sales-oriented. And we, in Germany and in Europe, we're oftentimes process-oriented, yeah? Sure. The nice thing is if you match those two, yeah, and you bring the two worlds together, you can actually build a very nice company. Many of the companies that have received external financing are being actually improved by U.S. influence. At the same time, you see with the emergence of certain other managers out of the European ecosystem going to the US, improving processes over there, and being very detail-oriented is actually the best of both worlds. So in terms of mentality, I couldn't agree more. We are less risk. We have less risk affinity. We are less risk-taking in general. Broadly speaking, of course, there's always outliers and different people for different reasons or matters. But in general, we can learn a lot from you in sales, and I think the process orientation and attention to detail is something that can be obtained from our part.
Yeah. Awesome, and it seems to me like the interest of foreign investors, especially the US recently, has increased quite a lot in the Berlin ecosystem, right? So we've had more and more VCs coming over, doing investments here, and also being more comfortable to take bets at an earlier stage. And I wonder why that is, and I think, Miles, maybe you can answer that since you've invested in both Wunderlist and ResearchGate in Berlin. What do you think moves US VCs to push money into the European ecosystem, and why are they doing it at an earlier stage now?
Yeah, I think the first time that a team will do it is always the hardest. Right? You don't know as many people on the ground. You haven't worked with any of the local venture firms. The seed stage is often about a network, right? Someone's going to come to you with their buddy and say, hey, we'd like to start this. Can you support us? And it's going to be a conversation over coffee and beer or whatever. And unless you're on the ground, it's hard to have that happen. But the more you've worked with partners over here, the easier it is to come in at an earlier stage.
As well. Yeah.
And I think sort of having the network and also feeling, if you're competing, which is always the case for the best opportunities, you want to be value add, as you always say, and that is a whole number of dimensions. But the more time you spend here, the more people you know here, the easier it is to be that.
Yeah, good point. And then related to this, I think typically, historically, a lot of the successful European startups, the classical playbook for them was that they were founded in Europe, and maybe Zendesk is a good example for this, right? Founded in Copenhagen 2007, 2009, they move over to the US, get US investors on board, and they start to scale the company there, and then IPO eventually. So typically, I think a lot of the European startups that had this kind of potential and promise, they used to move at least part of the team or the whole team over to the US and then continue to build the company there. Do you think that this is still true, or is something changing also with more foreign money coming in, or can unicorns be built in Europe as well? What is your view on that, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously happening more. We're seeing Spotify just raised at a massive valuation, and so it's happening more. And I think so we're investing much earlier stage than someone like Zendesk, but we do talk about that, and to me, it's a bit of a hack. Where it's like you meet with that US investor, it's like, oh, where are you based? It's like, oh, we're based in Berlin and San Francisco. And they're like, oh, and they nod accordingly. But really, like, you have one crappy desk in a co-working facility, and so you're sort of like faking it a little bit till you make it. But as I mentioned, like, yeah, they do want to feel like you're local, you have some presence there. So I do think that's a good path. Mm-hmm. And whether there's enough capital to sustain them all the way, I'm not sure. I think these gentlemen could answer that better. Yeah.
Well, if it comes to Europe, I think what was lacking in the past was a clear identification center for entrepreneurship. We didn't have this, epicenter of activity, which, comparable to New York or the Valley, where a lot of things were going on. I think that's changing dramatically. We're seeing more activity in Berlin, obviously. We're seeing it in London. We're seeing it partially in Paris. And once you have this center of gravity, more and more founders and people who want to work with startups know where to go. Yeah. Previously, they didn't know where to go. So if you wanted to attract, as a Zendesk, a good developer back in the day, you were probably pretty lost in Copenhagen. Yeah? It's an expensive place to live. Nobody knows that it's a tech hotspot. And where do you go? You go to the US, which is the mecca for venture financing and early stage startups. And that's changing, and I think that's a very encouraging sign and signal for the European ecosystem that we're seeing these centers of gravity. We're seeing them both in London and Berlin. I don't believe in this big tension between the two. I think there's enough space for both, and we need this center of gravity. We need the magnetism of a very important ecosystem, and more service providers and founders and developers will come and they will join, mix and mingle in these cities.
Yeah. I think it's also very related to the first question around kind of the difference in some mentality and then company dynamics. Like the US is a very homogenous market, and so you actually see companies get to massive growth a lot quicker. You see Zenefits right now it can have one sales team in the
Of 100
Midwest
people.
and grow throughout the country and target every small business, every large business there. And I think a Zendesk, it's great to come pretty early to the US because you can have one sales team, one marketing team, and they can scale throughout the country. You don't need different distribution partners in each country, localizing, etc. So I think here you actually see a lot more now as folks are actually doing products specifically for the European or actually more Eastern markets as well, and heading that way. TransferWise got to, I guess, close to $1 billion, without ever setting up a US office yet. Obviously they are now, and part of it's baked in, but I think you see it more as products are for this market specifically.
Yeah, awesome. Good, and let's assume there's a European startup, Berlin-based or wherever here in one of the hotspots, and it goes very well, it has good traction, and it attracts a lot of interest, and it has the luxury of choosing an investor, right? So they have incoming interest from US and European investors. Is there a big difference or is it really crucial to choose the right investor there? Are there advantages, disadvantages for going with a local versus an American investor? And I think, Mark, you can maybe answer this first, since you said it's not so much about EU versus US, but if you have the choice, do you have a preference, or would you recommend something to entrepreneurs that are in that position?
Well, my preferred choice would be Lakestar, of course, as a founder. No, jokes aside, I think we are big believers in syndication. Of course, every VC needs a meaningful stake in a business to make money in the end, but we're not equity greedy. In that sense, we're more Atlantic or more US-centric in our mindset. But if we have the opportunity to syndicate a deal, to get access to the US, for example, we've done lots of deals with Thrive. Both, they've been looking at our portfolio, we've been looking at theirs, and then we saw, there's opportunity to work together to add value for the company. That's a great opportunity to mix these two views, and the two networks can actually be very fruitful working together. So I think the ideal scenario is actually for a European startup entering the growth stage, where proximity to a location is not as important as the network, to actually start syndicating and looking at having a cap table that's diverse in nature, and adds different skill sets to the company, whatever may be needed at the very point in time.
Yeah, and I would say we're agnostic to where they are, and we've done deals, I think, definitely with Thrive and perhaps with you, and for us, really that matters. Let's say we're talking Series A, one great institution. That's all we need. That's the signal that we need, the validation that we need to sort of jump in.
And it doesn't matter whether it's US or
it doesn't, because we know that they're a good institution. They're likely going to take a board seat. Yeah. And so once again, we're part of the syndicate. We're not leading around. We're not taking a board seat. But we feel comfortable that the company's going to be in good shape, and we'll join any syndicate in that scenario.
Yeah. Good. So one part of the, I think, especially Berlin ecosystem that's quite unique is the company builders, right? At least you don't have them to that extent in the US. So you have players like Rocket Internet, obviously, also Team Europe, Project A, Hitfox, and now FinLeap, that are actually a lot of times coming in with the idea, building the team, scaling it, but then also own quite a large percentage of the cap table, right? What is your view on them in general? And do you think that they are US VC fundable? And maybe, Sean, this is a good question for you to start, since you're not a company builder, obviously, right? But as an accelerator, you take, I think, 7%? 7%. 7%. Yeah,
sometimes less.
Or less of the companies, which is obviously a very big difference to, I don't know, 40 to 75 or 90% that some of these incubators take.
Yeah, I mean, for us, no, I don't think it's a match for us. And yeah, especially Rocket Internet, they're taking a monster share, maybe even more than the majority. So no, for that's not us, because we're trying to basically be that bridge. We're usually jumping in the seed round, and so that's going to be very difficult for that company to go to a Series A. And in many cases, they don't, because Rocket's going to fund that thing, the majority, or they're going to find other partners to work with it too. So for us, it's not a match. I think other investors would be concerned as well too. Yeah. And in the end too, in Silicon Valley, the founder, he or she, I mean, they're coveted to a certain extent, and so their ownership needs to be enough to sort of maintain them throughout.
Incentivized.
Yeah, and so if they're only holding 10 or 15% of the company at sort of Series A or so forth, they're going to get swashed out to a single-digit %, and that actually scares many Silicon Valley investors.
Right. Yeah. Cool. What do you think, Mark?
It's a difficult topic. On the one hand, we love founders being in the driver's seat, and we like these guys who are very opinionated to some extent and really have their view of the world. And if you had asked Daniel Ek when we got to know him, wouldn't you want to join Deutsche Telekom Hubraum or Axel Springer Plug and Play to get some support, he would probably start running. Yeah, not because those programs are not good, but more because his personality is he wants to really run the show and define the way he thinks about music and recreate an industry, yeah? And that's hardly possible in a rigid structure. So the kind of entrepreneurs you'd like to fund, who really go for the big, you know, aim for the stars basically, they rarely feel compelled to work in a set structure like this. But given the immaturity of our ecosystem and lots of people being risk averse in the beginning, actually these incubators have an important role in leading people toward to the real entrepreneurship. So what you see is that more and more people go to an incubator and view it almost like a first job. They're like a McKinsey or BCG used to be, or an investment bank. They say, okay, I'm fine to give away part of the company, yeah, which is not even my own company. I'm more like a manager with equity. But at the same time, I get all the experience, I get the infrastructure, I get the financing as well. And then once I've made my first steps, I enter the next phase of entrepreneurship. And you see that emerging quite a lot here in Berlin. So I actually, as a catalyst for more entrepreneurial activity, I'm very positive on those developments on a macro level.
So it can be very educational as well,
right? It can be educational, and it can actually be, you know, look at simply Zalando. This example as an execution-driven, very you know, process-oriented business.
It makes sense.
The infrastructure made a lot of sense, and the founders, if you ask them, they're happy. So I think you have to take a very differentiated view on it, but as a VC, you probably prefer to work with the founders who have a very strong view and want to be in the driver's seat on a more general level.
Miles, do you think Trifold invest in an incubator company?
I think one should never say never. You know, there's always exceptions to any rule in this business in many ways. I think the point around incentives is an important one, right? It can often be a very long journey, and the first product that you launch with might not be the product that actually ends up scaling. And so making sure that a team, especially the senior management team, is incentivized to, you know, go on that journey for the long haul is important. I think the point around, though, helping the ecosystem and helping develop and train people is really valuable. You know, in many ways, actually, like, Y Combinator does many things, but I think what's interesting, to actually, back to your first question in many ways, in the US, you actually have this sort of cult of a very young entrepreneur, and that's actually in large part enabled by things like YC, right? You know, you have Dropbox coming out of school, Airbnb out of school, and there is that support ecosystem in the Valley for the young entrepreneur who needs to learn management, who needs to learn business, you know, but who can build a great product. You know, they take 7%, you know, whatever it is. There's different systems that can all reach the same goal, and it's figuring out, making sure that the principles of incentives and everything else hold true.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to it. Most of our founders, they're first-time founders. They don't know what they don't know. So I think in a lot of these incubators, I see they're taking sort of seasoned vets from other bigger industries, plunking them in, and sometimes that thing grows really quick, but then sometimes that person comes out and he or she is not scrappy enough and doesn't, you know, get the wheels spinning quick enough.
Got it. Okay. So I want to give the audience the opportunity to ask some questions as well, but before that, just one last kind of finishing question here from my side. Beyond the US and Europe, is there any market in particular that you're very excited about? And then, if so, why? And I think, Sean, also good question for you, since you're in over 10 markets now, I think, on the ground, and have investments in over 50.
Yes. Yeah. And the next market I'm doing is the Nordics. And I think the Nordics are very ignored, especially from Silicon Valley perspective. I think now we're seeing some of those larger companies come out, especially out of Stockholm. Very interesting ecosystem, lots of talent. We talked a little bit about sort of how do you mix the EU and US, sort of. That's what I'm trying to master, because they even have something called the law of Yanta, which is basically like, you don't brag. You're not really, you're not special. But of course, to me, it's like, if you're a founder, no, you are special. You know, you could have got the very cushy job, you know, at some fish place or oil place, but no, you took, like I said, the path of most resistance. So to me, I think there's potential, massive potential upside there. There's amazing capital there. It's just locked up and not available to early stage startups. So to me, I want to come in there and I want to help unlock some of that capital, and then help those companies go to a US audience or UK or wherever else, because their markets are too small typically to grow on their own.
Okay. And Miles, I think you guys invested in a couple of Brazilian companies.
Yeah, so we've done Brazil, and you know, in the early stages of, you know, talking to people and getting to know ecosystems in India and China. I think one place where we actually see a surprising number of companies that we get introduced to now is actually sort of Kenya and Africa. And I think I think what's interesting there is some of the infrastructures in place for these to now actually sort of be scalable products.
Yeah.
You've got Facebook for distribution in those countries. People have now got pretty high smartphone penetration. So there's some interesting things happening there as well.
Awesome. Any markets? Sorry. Any markets you're looking in for particular?
Well, I think what's happening in Asia is amazing right now. If you look at China in particular, obviously that's not an easy market. We allied and worked closely with the Alibaba group, for example, to identify opportunities there. And Jack Ma personally is a close friend to our group. We try to sort of find entry to that market through curation. It's very tough to do that without actual local market knowledge. So China is definitely on the horizon for us.
Awesome, cool. Thanks a lot, guys. Before we give them a hand, is there anything from the audience that you would like to ask these three gentlemen? Take the opportunity and do it now. Can we have a mic for him? Thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask, where do you see your industry focus, your factual industry focus in the near future?
Is that in terms of business model or?
Yes.
Do you have a?
I mean, we're super revenue focused, good unit economics, scalability. We're very early stage, so we need to see, I can't talk about signups or potentially installs. I need to see something more tangible. How much money are you making? What are the active users? We need very strong signals at the early stage because it is so high risk. I'm not sure if that was the question he was asking, but yeah.
Is that answering the question?
Yeah, I was more interested in are you looking into consumer goods or into fintech or into
the sectors you're investing
in. What verticals? Yeah, I mean, I'd say we're sort of very broad. We don't do things we don't understand, so we're not going to go into solar panels or rocket ships or anything like that. But we're heavy on consumer, mainly because most of our partners come from consumer companies. So those are the companies we know how to grow the best.
Yeah.
For us, it's internet and software across the board, both B2B and B2C, and it can be ideally applied globally, scaled fast. I mean, the general economic principles apply to all three of us, I believe, but we're generally more on the software side, so Internet of Things, hardware is probably less our DNA.
Yeah, I like some of the weird stuff, Bitcoin, drones, VR, incredibly early, and who knows where that's going to go, but we'll take some of those bets as well.
Yeah. And I think similar to what Thrive.
Same thing. I guess the only interesting caveat one might add is I think we're interested in an increasing number of sort of developer products, right? I think that's a buyer that has now got immense scale and actually importance within any company, and so particularly interested in those things as well.
I think we're running out of time, so maybe one more last question, if there is any. Everybody's shy. All right, then let's give a hand to the guys.
Great.
Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you.